My name is Paul Lubonovic, and I am a third-year law student here at Case Western Reserve University. We're here today with Dr. Kenneth Ledford, who's a professor of law and history at Case Western Reserve. We'll be discussing foreign policy and the United States presidential election. Dr. Ledford, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Mr. Lubonovic.
The issue of NATO has arisen in the United States presidential election. How did the candidates' positions on NATO differ, and what do their positions mean for the future of NATO and the United States?
It strikes me that you couldn't have a more diametrically opposed set of positions with respect to NATO. Secretary Clinton represents the traditional bipartisan American foreign policy, which has framed policy toward Europe since NATO was formed in 1949. NATO, of course, is a product of the Cold War. The jocular description was that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. With the end of the Cold War, many people argued that NATO had fulfilled its functions, but the newly liberated former Soviet satellite states and subject republics, such as the three Baltic republics, really wanted to be under the umbrella of the protection of NATO, and the United States, under President George H.W. Bush and under President Bill Clinton, worked very strongly to get NATO expanded. Many of these states have now become part of the European Union, so they essentially are a domestic part of political concerns for the Western European powers. With the return of Vladimir Putin to power, and the invasion of Crimea and the civil war in eastern Ukraine, all of this has been called into question. The reaction of the German leaders, especially Angela Merkel, has been to strengthen the German commitment to NATO, and the reaction of President Obama has been to strengthen the American commitment to NATO. We've just recently deployed new troops to the Baltics. So Secretary Clinton will continue this policy, which, as I said, was the policy of George W. Bush, as well as the Bill Clinton and President Obama. Donald Trump has said some radical things about NATO. He's looked at it purely as a financial kind of concern, arguing that, correctly, that NATO states haven't met their pledges to spend the designated percentage of their gross domestic product on defense spending, arguing that they're getting free rides from the United States. But the logic of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has always been that they would be under the nuclear umbrella of the United States in order to persuade them not to have nuclear weapons, which the United States also didn't want them to have. And this feeds into the whole notion that Donald Trump is particularly close to the Russians, that he admires the strongman stance of Vladimir Putin, and this has really destabilized the Europeans.
Okay. The issue of trade has also been an issue in this election, but most of it has focused on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But the United States is currently working on negotiations for the Transatlantic Investment
Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership,
which has obviously not been in the news since I can't remember it.
Right.
So has the candidates taken a position on this trade pact, and if so, how will the election affect those negotiations?
This is a very interesting kind of question. Happily for all of us, this is abbreviated TTIP, and that's how the Europeans refer to it as well. In general, I would argue that TTIP is another logical step, just as the TPP is with the neoliberal trade promotion policy, again, that has been the bipartisan policy under Republican and Democratic presidents over the last 40 years. The pushback from the Bernie Sanders campaign against trade deals, I think, has made Secretary Clinton very happy that this is on the back burner. She's had to disavow TPP, which she had initially embraced. Europeans are very much concerned about the secrecy that surrounds the negotiation of these trade deals, in which multinational corporations sit at tables with state actors, with diplomats, and negotiate, and it's kept secret because of the protection of trade secrets. TTIP is controversial in Europe, particularly because of fears by European populaces that it will be an opportunity for American agribusiness to force into European supermarkets genetically modified foods and meats, chicken, pork, beef, treated with growth hormones, which they have gotten out through EU legislation. So it's been very, very quiet. It remains to be seen whether, if elected, Secretary Clinton will embrace it, whether she'll reopen the negotiations. I suspect that would be the path, and I suspect that might be greeted with gratitude by European leaders, particularly Angela Merkel, to satisfy some of the dissatisfaction with free trade of her own domestic audience. Donald Trump presumably he hasn't mentioned this, but presumably because of his opposition to trade pacts of all kinds, either would want to negotiate it himself, the art of the trade pact deal, or would not sign the not give an American agreement to this.
Okay, so somewhat related to trade and the economic relations between the U.S. and Europe, Brexit has also come up as a new issue as they will be leaving the European Union, which will affect their trade relationships with Europe and their trade relationships with the United States. How did the candidates differ on their position with Brexit, and how will their positions affect Britain's leaving of the European Union?
Right. Well, I mean, Brexit obviously is a surprise to everyone, and it really is an English act. So it remains to be seen first whether Brexit will be executed, because no one has ever withdrawn from the European Union. There is a provision in the Treaty of Lisbon, Article 52, that permits this, but then it doesn't describe how. It simply sets a timetable. So it remains to be seen whether the British will pursue this. Second, there are challenges in this for Great Britain because neither Scotland nor Wales nor Northern Ireland voted in a majority for Brexit. This is an English vote. So this reopens the question, I think, of Scottish independence. Now, Donald Trump has clearly aligned himself with the Brexit forces. He's had Nigel Farage campaign for him in the United States, and he has argued that the polls are mistaken and that this will be a surprise, his election will be a surprise like Brexit's passage was. Secretary Clinton, again, has been quiet, but it has been the traditional policy of the United States to favor European integration. It remains to be seen what she does.
Going back to something you said earlier, but also kind of related to the Brexit conversation, the role of Russia has come up in the campaign rather surprisingly in some ways, and the Russians have always somewhat been seen as somewhat hostile to European integration. And it seems that maybe Donald Trump is, as well as his support of Brexit indicates. How do the candidates' positions on Russia differ, and how will those positions affect Russia's relationship to Europe going forward?
This is a great place to wind up our conversation. Donald Trump obviously models himself in some ways about Vladimir Putin. He argues that he has a special access to Putin's mind and understanding what Putin thinks. Angela Merkel also thinks that she has special access to Putin. Putin, of course, was a KGB agent in East Germany, speaks fluent German. Angela Merkel speaks fluent Russian, having grown up in the German Democratic Republic. Today, Wednesday, October 19th, Putin is at a summit meeting in Berlin, the first one he's been at for 6 months. But the Germans and the French are very concerned about Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. Secretary Clinton has condemned this very strongly. The Europeans are very worried about Donald Trump and fear that he would not resist this strongly enough.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Ledford, and thank you for watching.